I just wanted to talk a little bit today about gauge swatching and why it is important and how to do it. It's really important to make a gauge swatch if you are knitting something that has to fit, like a sweater or socks or a hat. If you do not get the stitches per inch called for in your pattern, most likely your garment is not going to fit and you will have wasted hours or days or even weeks knitting something. If you are designing your own pattern, you want to make sure that you're getting the number of stitches per inch that you got when you calculated from the measurements that you took to make sure that your item fits. Typically you will see a pattern call for gauge over stockinette stitch or garter stitch. Sometimes you will see a pattern say that gauge is not important, or you will see a pattern call for the swatch to be knitted over, or the gauge measured over the stitch pattern that is being used in the pattern. So it's usually measured over 4 inches, and that means that you want to make sure that your swatch is bigger than 4 inches, because sometimes your sides will be a little messy or the tops and bottoms are a little messy. You might have some curling if you're doing stockinette stitch without a border. So you want to make sure that you can get a good 4 inches right in the middle of your swatch. Now you can buy little gadgets like this where you can measure your stitches per inch, or something like this. However, you don't have to buy anything fancy like this. You can just use a good old-fashioned ruler. And if you don't have a ruler and you happen to work in an office, you can just kind of permanently borrow one, like I did this one. So this works just as well as these little gadgets here. And actually, I think that they work better, because if you're going to be measuring over 4 inches, this one only measures 2 inches, and the other one measures 2 inches also. You could measure just over 1 inch, but it's a little better to do it over the 4 inches. Like I said, that's usually what is recommended in most patterns. So I have a few things here just to show you how you might see gauge noted in patterns. Now this is for a stole, and personally myself, I will not be knitting a gauge swatch because this isn't something that really needs to fit well. It's just going to be, over my shoulder, so I'm not really that concerned about the finished size. But this pattern calls for the gauge swatch to be 5 stitches per inch over lace stitch pattern and working with yarn double-stranded. So that's one way that you may see gauge noted. Oops. I have here Victorian lace today, and the way that the gauge is noted in this book is just this little square right here. It's 24 stitches over 32 rows over stockinette stitch for this particular pattern. The gauge swatch for this is 18 stitches and 32 rows over garter stitch. And then I just have a couple magazines here to show you. This one is the current issue of Interweave Knits, and this pattern here calls for the gauge to be 12 stitches and 14 rounds equals 4 inches in the charted pattern, and then 12 stitches and 20 rounds equals 4 inches in stockinette stitch. And then the last one, this is the current issue of Knit and Style. This is just a little knitted necklace, and it has here 10.5 stitches equal 1 inch. Gauge is not critical for this project because this isn't really a fitted item, so that would be why the gauge isn't really important. Okay, and now I'm going to clear off all of this junk and get to the good stuff. Okay, so here I have a garter stitch sample, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to put my ruler down, and wait, first I want to show you When you're doing your garter stitch swatching, you're going to be counting these little bumps here. These are your stitches that you're going to be counting. You can see that there. So, pretending that I have washed and blocked this or done whatever I would be doing to a finished item that I've knit in this yarn. And this yarn is Babies First by Lion Brand, by the way. So you want to put your ruler down, or whatever you're using to measure. And you can use pins. I'm just going to use a double pointed needle here. And you want to mark the stitch that starts at the end of your measuring device. And just put that in there. And then take another one. And then go down to 4 inches. So this 4 inches is just after the end of this stitch. And you always want to measure half stitches as well, by the way. You can't just round up or down to a whole stitch. So, fortunately for here, for this swatch, 4 stitches is right at the end of a whole stitch. So I'm just going to stick that in here. You can use pins, a crochet hook, anything that you can just to slide under your stitch just so that you have it marked. Or you don't even have to use anything at all. You could just keep your ruler down and count with your finger or whatever. It's a little easier this way. So now I'm going to count my bumps here in between my 2 marked stitches. And this one counts as the first stitch. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So you want to take the number of stitches that you have and then divide by 4 because you're measuring over 4 inches. So 14 divided by 4 is 3.5. So in this yarn, using the needle size, I think I used a size 10 needle for this swatch, I get 3.5 stitches per inch. So then I would want to take 3.5 times whatever my measurements were if I were designing my own, or if my pattern called for 3.5 stitches per inch, I would be right on. Most of the time you may need to adjust your needle size to get the correct stitches per inch called for in a pattern. If you have more stitches than what is called for in your pattern, then you want to go up a needle size and try again. If you don't have as many stitches per inch as your pattern calls for, then you want to go down a needle size. So that would be my gauge for this stock or this garter stitch swatch. Now, like I said, you can also measure swatch or gauge in stockinette stitch. So I'm going to get that and show you. I didn't have time to knit a stockinette swatch for this video, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and use this sweater that I've been working on to show you the stockinette stitch gauge. And it's the same as the garter stitch. You want to put your ruler down and then put your marker, your pin, whatever you're using, in at the first stitch. And let me just show you what your stockinette stitches look like. I'm sure you already know, but for those of you who may not. And I think that measuring in stockinette stitch is a lot harder because it's hard for me to pick out the stitches. But here's what your stitches will look like in stockinette stitch. You want to be measuring your little V's. So this right here is a stitch. This right here is a stitch. If you can see that right there, let me just pick that up. So you can see that's your stitch. That's what you want to be measuring. So you would want to put your ruler down at the beginning of a stitch, put your marker in, and then go down to 4 inches put your marker in, and then again, like in the garter stitch sample, you would just count however many stitches you have in between your markers and then divide by 4, and that would give you your stitches per inch in the stockinette, in whatever yarn and needles you're using. Your gauge in the round is going to be a little bit different probably than it is when you're working flat. So if you're knitting socks, the best way to check your gauge is to either knit yourself a little sample in the round, or this little trick that I'm going to show you now pretty closely simulates a swatch in the round without actually doing a complete sample in the round. So when you're done knitting your row, instead of turning and working back as you normally would, since when you knit in the round, you just keep going and going and going, there is no turning of the work. Take your stitches and slide them to the other end of the needle, and then take your yarn and make sure that you leave a lot of slack. You can see here this that I have. It looks messy, but it's important if you want to lay your piece flat to measure your gauge. Leaving a lot of slack, and I just hold the yarn in one of my fingers on my right hand. It depends on whatever way you knit, just however is comfortable for you. And then make sure that you're using your working yarn. You want to start knitting again. So I'm holding the slack yarn here, and the working yarn is ready to be used. You just want to knit another row. This is basically the same concept you use when you're knitting an I-cord. You knit your stitches, and then instead of turning the work, you just slide the stitches to the other end of your needle and keep going. But in the instance of an I-cord, you want to make sure that you're not leaving any slack. So just pretend like you're knitting an I-cord, but you're not tightening it up. You're leaving yourself a lot of slack in the back. That's one way to think of this. So by doing it like this, you're always working on the front of your fabric, which is what you do when you knit in a round. You're always working on the front. So just knit all the way to the end of the row, and then again, instead of turning the work, you would just slide your stitches to the other end of the needle. Give yourself a lot of slack. Hold on to that spare yarn, or the yarn that you're leaving for slack. And I have a little bit of yarn barf here, so I can't continue, but I think you get the idea. You would just keep doing that, and then when you bind off, because you've left yourself all of this slack, you will be able to lay your swatch flat and get your gauge. You'll be able to measure accurately. So you can see here, it's kind of like this has been knit in the round, but the back is just loose. See, there's my tube, but I only knit a little bit. Obviously, if you were doing this to take a measurement, you would want to make it a lot bigger, but I just have this little tiny piece here for an example. So that is it for gauge. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.